I'm really here to put a face to the facts. Right? I am here to show you that what you hear about, the numbers and the diagnoses and the labels, these are people. These are human beings who, like Adrian said, we need housing, we deserve housing. Housing for me was a crucial part of my healing journey. And I'm going to share with you kind of a little bit about my history and kind of why, for me, when I got the supports I needed alongside with housing, how that really propelled my own healing journey. And I also want to provide a context for both myself and the people you may see with those diagnoses. Why am I in the mental health system? How did I land here? My story is unique only that it is mine. And I think you'll hear in my story, perhaps your own, perhaps your friends, perhaps the family members. So we're all aware, I think, of the opioid epidemic that we're currently dealing with, the drastic number of people from every walk of life who are dying from their dependence on opioids. We hear about the human and the financial cost of addressing the issue of drug dependence and the many ramifications of addiction, poverty, homelessness, crime. I recently listened to a few different podcasts on the topic of complex trauma and how people learn to cope with that trauma. I guess we all have different ways of surviving running on the treadmill. That was mine, kind of listening to these podcasts. And for myself, my own traumas that I experienced beginning in childhood could easily have landed me in the midst of the opioid epidemic. I found other ways, however, to cope with what was not survivable. Self-injury, eating disorders, depression accompanied by constant suicidality, quote-unquote behaviors that enabled me to survive my childhood sexual abuse. These were the coping skills that I had as I entered adulthood to try and navigate life while simultaneously dealing with the ramifications of complex trauma. I will share some of my story, some of my context for developing kind of the behaviors, moods, symptoms that landed me in the mental health system. When you hear the words the mentally ill, what comes to mind? Is it the person you see talking to themselves on the street corner, perhaps panhandling? Is it what you hear about in the media, the person who was violent and recently murdered somebody because of their mental illness? Is it me as I stand here now before you able to articulate my experience? Is it me 15 years ago who couldn't utter a word? Is it the small child who's afraid of the night and who acts out during the day as a way to try and explain what they're experiencing? We need to understand that behind the diagnosis, behind the stigma is a person with a context for landing where we are today. And for any of you that don't work in the mental health field, and I know we have a real mix here, kind of who's in the audience, I guess I'm asking you all to be curious when you hear the words, when you hear the labels. My own journey of mental health recovery has included a painful exploration of my own trauma. Growing up amidst abuse and ramifications that continue to this day, my understanding of myself, the world, and my place in the world was not one initially of hope or inclusion. A therapist I once worked with said in a presentation that for trauma survivors to heal, they need three things: safety, trust, and consistency. If you think about someone who is experiencing a mental health crisis or a longer duration struggle with behavioral health, it's clear that a necessary component for healing and recovery is access to safe housing and appropriate community supports. One cannot focus on addressing the underlying factors related to your suicide attempts or self-injury or depression or overdosing if you don't even know where you're going to sleep at night. As trauma survivors, our bodies are hardwired into flight, freeze, or fight. If you think about it, if you go back to your kind of Psych 101 class with Maslow's hierarchies of needs, what do we need first? We need that physiological safety. We need to know we have a place to lay our head. We need to know we're going to be fed. We need to know we're going to have people who can listen to us and understand that human connection. For me, during the many years that I was in and out of hospitals, my emotional and cognitive energy was focused on trying to find the will to live. Logistical factors of living were not in the forefront of my mind, and quite frankly, they weren't really possible. So logistical things, like I couldn't call my student loan company about needing a forbearance. I couldn't investigate how to get food stamps. I couldn't open the many hospital bills I was receiving. Getting out of bed, getting to treatment, keeping myself alive, those were my successes. And I definitely didn't have the internal resources to investigate whether affordable housing existed and how to go about contacting a landlord. And affordable is relative when you're living on SSDI, by the way. So for me, when I think back kind of when I was in the midst of my really hardest struggles, and I was really lucky to have my mom and my stepfather there by my side, all that we were trying to deal with in our family, with me, with my health, trying to find services, trying to find appropriate services and supports. It's a lot. It's a lot for a family, it's a lot for an individual, and for me, most of the time, it was just too much. My mom was able to offer me a room during many of the time periods that I didn't have a place to stay. My family was able to connect me with some housing resources, like the Bethany Hill School in Framingham. They provided me with a small reduced-cost studio apartment and a community. Community is so, so important for healing. A parent, however, can only do so much for an adult child, especially one who is actively trying to destroy themselves. My self-destruction, like many of those that I've met along my journey, it was an effort to stop the incessant emotional pain I was experiencing. I needed skilled supports, and during that time, yet finding that was difficult and overwhelming. I started receiving DMH supports in 2004, and at that point I was staying with my mom. I had been in the mental health system by that point for 13 years, and I was still in need of ongoing intensive supports for my trauma issues and my eating disorder. But by that point, no program wanted to take me, no hospital wanted to take me, no therapist wanted to take me. And it was just an incredible stress on everyone involved. But I was lucky that I had a DMH case manager, and she did able to find me a placement at a staff department building. I was on the right path, but even that was not adequate to meet my needs. I ended up having another admission on an acute unit. The staff there had already been telling me that they would rather see me committed to a state hospital and alive than have me die. At this last admission, they did indeed petition for a state hospital commitment. At this point, my story could have ended. I could have been another statistic, another lost cause, another seriously mentally ill person who was too broken to be healed. I, however, was lucky. I was diverted from the state hospital to an intensive group home run by local community provider advocates. After 2 years of being in the group home, I was discharged back to the community, but this time with both housing and community supports in place. I initially lived with a roommate in an apartment that was owned by advocates and under HUD. This alone was a terrifying move for me. In all my adult life, I had not been able to maintain staying in the community. Consistently over the years, I have been stuck in that revolving door of hospitals, partial hospitals, back to hospitals, no place to stay, back to hospitals. But this time, I was able to vocalize my concerns, and I was provided with what I needed for community supports and housing. A year after I moved out of a group home, I was granted a DMH voucher for an apartment, and it was around this time, a little bit after that, that I met Adrienne. And she'll be speaking about the importance of these particular vouchers, these opportunities for housing for those of us deemed not able to live in the community, those of us who don't have a rental history, those of us who don't even know how to be a good tenant. I'm still learning. Without that voucher, my ability to get an apartment would have been on hold. And for me, that would have meant that my journey of recovery would have been on hold. Finding an apartment was step one, a step I didn't know how to take and I was terrified of. Why would someone rent to me? A person with no rental history and poor credit and only a part-time job. I knew I would need to mention the voucher to a landlord, which felt like saying, hey, I'm crazy enough to need services, but please rent to me. I found an apartment I really liked in Northborough. I went to view it with a staff member who looked around and was like, wow, this is a really nice apartment. I shrunk inside myself because I didn't deserve to live in a nice place. I didn't see myself really as a member of society. I wasn't supporting myself financially. In my worldview, I was still perceiving myself as nothing. That landlord denied me the apartment, supposedly because of my credit score. It didn't really matter to him that with that voucher, he was guaranteed to get paid. Perhaps I could have then moved along at that point. I had not yet met Adrian, and I didn't have the voice to advocate for myself with that landlord. I didn't even see myself as worth fighting for. I did have an outreach clinician at the time who helped me find a different apartment, this time with a local landlord who was familiar with advocates, was familiar with the voucher program, didn't give me a problem. And I moved in, full of fear and excitement. I had begun working as a peer specialist for advocates the year before that. So I was working in a field where it's my job to share my lived experience with other people who are struggling. My job to share with people who are experiencing distress that there is hope. So I'm on my journey, I'm working in this brand new field, and I'm terrified. Around that time, I had adopted my cat Magic, who Adrian mentioned, and there I was. I had a home. I had supports I could meet with regularly to talk about my concerns and my fears and my struggles. And I had a companion. A few years later, I did increase my hours at work, and I went off with Social Security benefits. I was now working 30 hours a week and learning that I was more than just a burden. I was a person with a lot to offer. I was also still a person in need. Thankfully, this was recognized, and my community supports continued for a few years while I went on to develop those natural supports I would need to taper off of those benefits. I eventually moved into a site-based subsidy, and that meant that my DMH voucher was now available for somebody else. I increased my hours at work to full-time, and finally, after nearly 10 years on the wait list, I got that golden ticket. I got that Section 8 voucher. A little bit late there, folks, but I got it eventually, right? And I moved into my current apartment with my cat Magic, and I continued to build on the successes that I had achieved. Not having the stress of being homeless, I can't emphasize the importance of that enough. It gave you a little bit of extra boost to work on what I need to work on for myself. Recovery is all about connections and building relationships. But for me to learn how to be vulnerable and to be in relationships, I first needed safety and stability. I needed a place I knew I could call home, and people I knew I could rely on for support. I transitioned out of intensive community services a few years ago. It was difficult and frightening, and the crucial ingredients for my successful discharge were having a stable and safe place to live, having both natural supports and clinical supports in the community, having a job that was meaningful, having a pet that gave me a reason to get out of bed in the morning, and having a family that cared and stuck by my side. Life isn't rainbows and unicorns. The pain and distress and depression are still a part of my everyday life. But at that point, they were no longer the only things in my life. I was learning how to live, how to manage relationships, the demands of working, interacting with landlords, and learning how to be a good tenant, all while also managing and improving my behavioral health. The fear of losing my apartment has been quite strong over the years due to so many years of housing insecurity. I recently began a new job, and I have new opportunities that I never thought would be within my reach. I have an income that will enable me to come off of my Section 8 voucher, which I feel like I just got. And as terrifying as it is for me to anticipate being kind of without that voucher, I know I'm in a way paying it forward. There is such a scarcity of these types of vouchers that undoubtedly somebody in need will themselves soon receive that letter. That letter from the local housing authority offering the person to make an appointment to review their application and receive that golden ticket. That letter that embodies hope. My own journey of recovery, healing, whatever you want to name it, it continues. I know that I would likely not be alive had I not received the many different types of supports I have had. I needed housing that was safe and stable alongside intensive community supports. Again, I'm one of the lucky ones. And luck should not be necessary when we are talking about people's lives. There are too many people in our communities who are struggling with the vicious combination of mental health challenges, homelessness, poverty. I am just here to represent so many others. And we are all here today to learn, to spread awareness, and to bring hope to our communities. Thank you.